As the signal flags rose and the great war drums began their thunderous beat, Selim allowed himself one final moment of doubt. One last question whispered into the wind that carried them toward destiny. "Father, was this the price you foresaw? Is this the bill that comes due for all your magnificence?" The wind offered no answer. It only filled their sails and drove them forward toward a battle that would reshape the Mediterranean, toward a sea that would soon burn with Greek fire and Ottoman blood, toward a day that would be remembered as the moment when the tide of history turned. The Battle of Lepanto was beginning, and Sultan Selim II, the scholar who had never wanted to be a warrior, the son who could never match his father's legend, sailed toward it with 300 ships and the weight of empire pressing down upon his crown. Behind him, in the waist of the Sultana, stood a young man whose presence on this deck should have been impossible. His name was Mehmet, and he was no sailor, no soldier, no nobleman of the court. He was a physician's apprentice from the streets of Istanbul, 23 years old, with clever hands and a mind that questioned everything his teachers tried to hammer into it. He should have been in the palace hospital, learning the art of healing from the masters of Ottoman medicine. Instead, through a series of circumstances that even now seemed like divine intervention or cosmic jest, he found himself on the flagship of the Ottoman fleet, carrying a leather satchel full of surgical tools and herbs, preparing to tend wounds from weapons he had only read about in ancient texts. Mehmet gripped the ship's rail as the vessel picked up speed, watching the mist clear to reveal the enemy fleet. His stomach churned, not from the motion of the waves, but from a creeping certainty that he was about to witness suffering on a scale beyond anything his teachers had prepared him for. "First battle?" asked a voice beside him. Mehmet turned to find a janissary, one of the elite soldiers who formed the Ottoman army's core, leaning against the rail with the casual ease of a man who had seen dozens of such battles. The soldier was perhaps 40, his beard shot through with gray, a wicked scar running from his left eyebrow to his jawline. "Is it that obvious?" Mehmet asked. "You have the look of a man trying to remember if he said goodbye to everyone he loved." Hassan smiled, but there was no mockery in it. "I'm Hassan. I've been fighting Christians since before you were born, boy, and I'll give you the only advice worth remembering. When the killing starts, you won't have time to be afraid. Fear is a luxury for the hours before battle and the years after." "I'm not a fighter," Mehmet said. "I'm here to heal, not to hurt." Hassan's expression softened. "A physician? Then you'll see worse than any of us soldiers. We only have to watch men die. You'll have to watch them beg you not to let them." He paused, studying Mehmet with eyes that had seen too much. "But you'll also save lives today. Maybe dozens, maybe hundreds. And when this is over, those men will remember your face in a way they'll never remember mine." Before Mehmet could respond, a new sound cut through the morning air, a deep, resonating boom that seemed to shake the very water beneath their hull. Then another, and another. The galleasses had opened fire. The Christian cannons, positioned high on those floating fortresses, were firing directly into the advancing Ottoman line. At this distance, still more than 1,000 yards, their aim was poor, and most of the iron balls plunged harmlessly into the sea, sending up geysers of white water that sparkled in the morning sun. But some found their marks. Mehmet watched in horror as a cannonball struck an Ottoman galley 3 ships to their left. The ball punched through the vessel's bow at the waterline, and even from this distance he could hear the screams of men trapped below deck as the sea rushed in. "And so it begins," said Hassan quietly. "May Allah have mercy on us all." On the command deck, Sultan Selim stood unmoved as the cannons roared, though his fingers had unconsciously found the prayer beads at his belt. Ali Pasha was shouting orders, adjusting our formation to minimize the damage from the galleasses, but both men knew that the next hour would determine whether the Ottoman Empire remained the dominant power in the Mediterranean, or whether 4 centuries of expansion would crash against these waters like waves against rock. "All ships increase speed," Ali commanded. "Close the distance. Those cannons cannot depress low enough to hit us if we get close." The war drums intensified their rhythm, and 300 Ottoman galleys surged forward, their oars beating the water into foam. The rowers below deck, slaves and criminals, men whose lives were measured in strokes and sweat, pulled with desperate strength, knowing that their survival depended on reaching the enemy before the cannons could find their range. Another boom, another cannonball arcing through the perfect morning air. This one struck the Sultana herself, impacting the starboard rail not 30 feet from where the Sultan stood. The wood exploded in a shower of splinters, and men screamed as razor-sharp fragments tore through flesh and bone. Mehmet was running before he realized he had moved, his satchel in hand, his mind automatically cataloging injuries and treatments, even as his heart raced with terror. The first wounded man he reached had a splinter the size of a dagger embedded in his chest, blood bubbling from his lips as he tried to breathe through a punctured lung. "Hold him down," Mehmet commanded the soldiers nearby, his voice steadier than he felt. "Hold him firmly." The soldiers' eyes found Mehmet's face, and in them the young physician saw not fear, but a strange gratitude. Gratitude that someone was trying, that he would not die alone and forgotten in the chaos of battle. Mehmet's hands moved with practiced precision, clearing the airway, packing the wound with cloths soaked in wine, whispering prayers his mother had taught him even as he worked. The soldier gasped, coughed, and then, miraculously, drew a clean breath. "Take him below," Mehmet ordered. "Keep pressure on the wound. Don't let him—" His words were cut off by a sound unlike anything he had ever heard, a roar that seemed to come from the throat of the world itself. The Ottoman fleet had reached the Christian line, and 300 ships were colliding with 200 more in an impact that sent shockwaves across the water. The Battle of Lepanto had truly begun, and the sea was about to catch fire. The moment of collision was not the clean, precise engagement that poets would later describe. It was chaos incarnate. Wood splintering against wood, bronze rams punching through hulls, men screaming orders that no one could hear over the thunder of cannons and the crash of breaking timber. The Sultana struck of the Venetian galley broadside, the Ottoman ram puncturing the enemy's hull with a sound like the world splitting open. Immediately, janissaries poured across the gap, their scimitars flashing in the sun, their war cries rising above the pandemonium. The Venetians met them with boarding pikes and Spanish steel, and the deck of the enemy ship became a writhing mass of bodies locked in the most intimate form of warfare humanity had ever devised. Mehmet crouched behind a stack of water barrels on the Sultana's deck, tending to a continuous stream of wounded men, even as the battle raged around him. An archer with 3 fingers severed by a Venetian blade, a rower whose leg had been crushed when a cannon recoiled improperly, a janissary with his face split open by a Spanish sword, still conscious, still asking if he had killed the man who had marked him. The young physician's hands were red to the elbows now, his carefully organized medical supplies scattered and stained. He worked with an efficiency born of pure necessity, making decisions in heartbeats that would haunt him for years. This man might live with treatment. That one was already dead, though his heart still beat. This one could walk to the surgeon below deck. That one would never walk again. "Physician!" A soldier was dragging another toward him, this one with an arrow protruding from his shoulder at an angle that suggested it had pierced the lung. "Help him! He's the admiral's nephew!" Mehmet looked up into the face of a boy. He could not have been more than 16, whose eyes were wide with shock and incomprehension. The physician in him noted the symptoms of traumatic pneumothorax. The boy's breathing was shallow and rapid, his lips were beginning to turn blue, and there was a terrible whistling sound coming from the wound. But the human being in Mehmet saw only a child who should have been learning poetry or horsemanship, not dying on a blood-soaked deck while his uncle commanded a fleet in a battle that might consume them all. "Lay him down gently," Mehmet commanded, his voice cutting through the boy's panic. "Look at me. That's right. Keep your eyes on mine." As his hands moved to assess the wound, Mehmet became aware of a presence looming over them. He looked up to find Sultan Selim himself standing there, the ruler of the Ottoman Empire, looking down at the dying boy with an expression that transcended his station. Here was not a sultan, but simply a man watching another young life bleeding away. "Can you save him?" Selim asked, and there was no imperial command in the question, only desperate hope. "I don't know," Mehmet answered honestly, because lying to sultans seemed less wise than acknowledging the limits of mortal medicine. "The arrow has punctured his lung, and removing it might kill him faster than leaving it in. But if I don't remove it, the wound will fester, and he'll die slowly over days." "Then remove it," the boy gasped, his hand suddenly gripping Mehmet's wrist with surprising strength. "I would rather die a warrior's death today than a coward's death in a fever tent." Mehmet looked into those young eyes and saw a courage that shamed him. Here was a boy facing his mortality with more grace than the physician who should have been his comfort. "Hold him," Mehmet said to the surrounding soldiers, "and someone find me wine, strong wine, and a burning coal from the cooking brazier." What happened next was a surgery performed in the midst of hell. As the battle raged around them, as men killed and died not 20 feet away, as cannons boomed and ships burned, as the sea itself seemed to rebel against the violence being done upon its surface, Mehmet cut away cloth and flesh, extracted an arrow that had gone deeper than any arrow had a right to go, and cauterized the wound with a white-hot coal that made the boy scream so loudly that even battle-hardened janissaries flinched. But the boy lived. Sultan Selim watched it all, and when it was done, when the boy lay unconscious but breathing, the Sultan's hand came to rest on Mehmet's shoulder. "What is your name, physician?" "Mehmet ibn Ibrahim, your majesty. I was an apprentice at the palace hospital." "You are an apprentice no longer. From this day forward, you are a master physician in the service of the Ottoman Empire. Should we survive this battle, you will be granted estates and honors befitting the man who saved my admiral's nephew." Before Mehmet could respond, before he could explain that he had done nothing special, that any physician worth his training would have done the same, a new sound cut through the chaos of battle. It was a roar from hundreds of throats, a collective cry of alarm that even the Sultan turned toward the bow of the ship. Ali Pasha was there, pointing toward the center of the Christian line, his face ashen. "Your Majesty, the Marquesa, she's deploying Greek fire!" Greek fire, the ancient weapon that had defended Constantinople for centuries, the secret formula that burned on water and could not be extinguished by normal means. It was a Byzantine invention, supposedly lost when the city fell to the Ottomans in 1453. But the Venetians, it seemed, had preserved the knowledge, or rediscovered it. From the deck of the Marquesa, one of the great Venetian galleasses at the center of the Christian formation, Mehmet could see flames being pumped through long brass tubes. The liquid fire arced through the air in streams of orange and red, landing on the decks of Ottoman galleys with results that defied nature itself. The fire did not simply burn, it exploded on contact, spreading across wood and water alike, clinging to men's flesh like a living thing, burning with such intensity that it generated its own wind. Ottoman sailors threw themselves into the sea to escape the flames, only to find that the fire followed them into the water, that the sea itself had become an instrument of agony. "Fall back!" Ali was shouting. "All ships, fall back from the galleasses!" But falling back was easier commanded than achieved. The battle had evolved into a chaotic melee where friend and foe were locked together in death grips, where ships that tried to disengage found themselves rammed by others pressing forward, where the only directions were forward into fire or backward through comrades. Selim watched his fleet beginning to fracture, saw the first signs of panic spreading through crews that had never known defeat, and made a decision that would define his legacy. "Signal the left and right wings," he commanded Ali. "They are to break off and sail around the galleasses. We don't fight through them, we go around them. Target the smaller Christian galleys on the flanks, sink them or capture them, but do not engage those floating fortresses directly."
"And the center?" Ali asked quietly. "The Sultan's tet and the ships with us." Selim's jaw tightened. "We hold. We draw their attention and their fire. We give our wings time to collapse their flanks." It was a strategy born of desperation. Sacrifice the center to save the wings, but it was also tactically sound. The galleasses were devastating, but they were slow and cumbersome. If the Ottoman wings could eliminate the lighter Christian galleys on the flanks, they could sweep around and attack the galleasses from behind, where their cannons could not depress to fire. If the center could hold long enough. "Your Majesty," Ali said quietly, "what you propose is suicide for every ship in the center squadron." "Then we die," Selim replied, and there was something in his voice that Mehmet, still kneeling beside the unconscious boy, had never heard from a sultan before. It was acceptance, perhaps, or resignation, or maybe just the terrible clarity that comes when a man realizes he has reached the point where all choices lead to suffering, and the only question remaining is what kind of suffering he will choose. The signal flags went up, the war drums changed their rhythm, and across the center of the Ottoman line, 36 ships, including the Sultana, began a coordinated advance directly into the teeth of the Christian galleasses and their unholy fire. Mehmet watched them come, those streams of Greek fire arcing across the water like the breath of dragons, and understood with cold certainty that this was how the world ended. Not with poetry or glory, not with heroic deaths that minstrels sang about, but with men burning alive while they screamed for mothers who could not save them, with flesh melting from bone, with the smell of cooking meat and the sounds of prayers that went unanswered.
A drop of Greek fire landed on the deck not 10 feet from where he crouched, and instantly the wood erupted in flames that spread faster than thought. Sailors rushed to contain it, throwing sand and water, but the fire laughed at their efforts, dancing and leaping as if it possessed a malevolent intelligence. "Get back!" Mehmet shouted, grabbing the unconscious boy and dragging him away from the spreading inferno. "Everyone back!" But even as he retreated, he saw other ships suffering worse. The Pasha's Pride, a galley that had sailed beside them since leaving Constantinople, was completely engulfed, a floating pyre from which no screams emerged because everyone aboard was already dead. The crescent moon had taken a stream of Greek fire directly onto her rowing deck, and the slaves chained to the oars were burning while they pulled, their final movements jerking the oars in a grotesque parody of rowing that drove the burning ship directly into another Ottoman vessel. This was not battle. This was apocalypse. And still, Sultan Selim stood on the command deck, refusing to flinch as the world burned around him, his eyes fixed not on the destruction before him, but on the flanks, where his wings were finally beginning to engage the lighter Christian forces. "Come on," he whispered, though whether he was praying to Allah or pleading with his own commanders, Mehmet could not tell. "Move faster. Flank them. End this." On the left wing of the Ottoman fleet, a commander named Mahmud Pasha saw his opportunity. The Venetian and Genoese galleys on the Christian left were beginning to pull back, trying to reposition to support their center, and in doing so, they had opened a gap in their line. Mahmud was a veteran of 40 naval engagements, a man who understood that battles were won not by courage, but by exploiting the momentary mistakes of the enemy. He saw the gap, calculated the angles and distances with an unconscious expertise born of decades at sea, and gave the order that would turn the tide of battle. "Full speed, through the gap, all ships follow the dragon's wing." 20 Ottoman galleys surged forward like wolves sensing wounded prey. They punched through the gap in the Christian line, their rams finding targets with devastating efficiency, their archers firing down onto enemy decks from positions of superior height. The Venetian and Genoese galleys, caught in the confusion of repositioning, found themselves attacked from an unexpected angle, their neat formations dissolving into chaos. On the right wing, similar scenes were unfolding. The Ottoman right, led by the brilliant young commander Uluç Ali, was systematically dismantling the Christian right flank with a combination of superior seamanship and pure aggression.
Uluç Ali had the advantage of knowing these waters intimately. He had raided Christian shipping in the Mediterranean for 20 years, and he used that knowledge to position his ships perfectly, driving wedges between enemy vessels, isolating and destroying them one by one. But in the center, where Sultan Selim held his position, the situation had deteriorated beyond desperate. Half the ships of the center squadron were burning or sinking. The water was choked with debris and bodies, men who had drowned or burned, men who had been crushed between colliding ships, men who floated face down with arrows in their backs or swords through their bellies. The Sultana herself had taken 3 direct cannon hits and was listing to port, water pouring into her lower decks. Ali Pasha was screaming orders to the pumping crews, but everyone knew it was only a matter of time before the flagship went down. Mehmet had abandoned his medical station and was now helping to fight fires, throwing water from buckets passed hand to hand from the pumps below. His physician's robes were scorched and sodden, his carefully maintained neutrality as a healer abandoned in the simple urgency of keeping the ship afloat. Beside him, old Hassan the Janissary was doing the same, and as they worked side by side in the smoke and chaos, the soldier shouted over the roar of flames, "Still think you're just here to heal?" "I think," Mehmet shouted, "that I'm here to do whatever keeps us alive long enough to see tomorrow." Hassan laughed, actually laughed in the midst of that hell, and for a moment Mehmet understood something about soldiers that he had never grasped before. They didn't fight because they were brave, they fought because fighting was the only alternative to surrender, and surrender meant watching everything they loved burn while they did nothing. A cry went up from the crow's nest, the lookout's voice cracking with either hope or horror. "The Christian center is advancing! Don John's flagship is moving forward!" Every head on the Sultana turned toward the heart of the Christian line, where the massive Spanish galley that served as Don John's command ship was pushing forward through the smoke and chaos. Behind it came a dozen more galleys, fresh vessels that had been held in reserve, now committed to deliver the killing blow to the Ottoman center. Selim watched them come, and Mehmet, standing not 20 feet from his sultan now, separated by circumstance from the rigid hierarchies of court, saw the moment when acceptance became something else. Not despair exactly, but a kind of transcendent calm, the expression of a man who has looked into the abyss and decided that if he must fall, he will fall standing. "Your Majesty," Ali said urgently, "we must transfer your flag to another ship. The Sultana is sinking, and if the Christians capture you—" "No," Selim's voice was absolute. "I will not abandon this ship while she still floats. I will not abandon these men while they still fight." "Your Majesty, your father would never have—" "Your father," Selim interrupted, and there was steel in his voice now, "conquered half the world and left me an empire too vast to defend. I will not add to his legacy of endless war. If we must die here today, then we die having learned something he never did, that there are some tides even Ottoman might cannot turn." The reel was close now, so close that Mehmet could see the individual faces of the Spanish Marines on her deck, could see Don John himself standing at the bow in armor that caught the sun like captured lightning. The Spanish commander was young, younger than Selim, and there was something in his posture that spoke of absolute conviction, of a man who believed his cause was blessed by divine providence. The 2 flagships were going to collide. Nothing could prevent it now. "All hands," Ali roared. "Prepare for boarding. Archers to the rails. Janissaries forward." Mehmet found himself gripping a fallen sailor's sword, though he had never been trained in its use, though every oath he had ever taken as a physician forbade him from raising weapons against other men. But in this moment, with death not as an abstract concept, but as a Spanish galley bearing down upon them with the inevitability of fate itself, such oaths seemed like luxuries from a gentler world that no longer existed. The impact, when it came, was almost anticlimactic, a grinding crunch as the 2 ships locked together, neither achieving the perfect ram that would have ended the contest instantly. For a moment, there was a strange silence as both crews stared at each other across the gap of perhaps 10 feet, Ottoman and Christian, separated by that small distance and the unbridgeable chasm of faith and history and blood. Then someone, Mehmet never knew who, screamed a war cry, and the two sides threw themselves at each other with a fury that transcended warfare and became something primal, something that existed since the first humans looked at other humans and saw not brothers, but enemies. The fighting was not the stylized dueling of legends. It was brutal, desperate, chaotic, men slipping on blood-slicked decks, grappling and biting and clawing when their weapons were knocked away, crying out not in defiant war cries, but in simple animal pain. Mehmet found himself facing a Spanish marine whose eyes held the same terror that must have shone in his own, and in that moment before they engaged, the young physician understood that his opponent was no crusading fanatic, but simply another frightened young man who wanted to live.
They fought anyway. Mehmet's borrowed sword deflected a blow that would have split his skull. His clumsy return strike missed entirely, overbalanced him, sent him sprawling onto the deck. The Spanish Marine raised his blade for a killing stroke, and then Hassan was there, the old janissary moving with a speed that belied his years, his scimitar opening the Spaniard's throat in a single economical motion. Blood sprayed across Mehmet's face as the Marine fell, gurgling, his eyes going glassy with shock. "Stay close to me," Hassan commanded, pulling Mehmet to his feet, "and stop trying to kill them with kindness." Around them, the battle continued with mindless ferocity. Mehmet could see Sultan Selim himself now engaged in combat, the ruler of the Ottoman Empire wielding his sword with surprising skill, fighting beside his men with none of the distance that usually separated monarchs from soldiers. Nearby, Ali Pasha was directing the janissaries in a coordinated effort to push back the Spanish borders, his commands cutting through the chaos like a voice of sanity in bedlam. But the Spanish kept coming. For every one that fell, two more seemed to take his place, and Mehmet realized with sick certainty that the Real carried many more Marines than the Sultana. The Ottoman flagship had been built for speed and maneuverability, not for the grinding infantry battle that this engagement had become. They were being overwhelmed. And then, just as Mehmet was certain that he would die on this deck with a Spanish blade in his gut, a new sound cut through the battle. A sound that made even the Spanish Marines pause in their assault, their heads turning toward the source with expressions of dawning horror. It was the war drums of the Ottoman left wing, and they were very, very close. Mahmud Pasha's 20 galleys had completed their flanking maneuver and were sweeping down on the Spanish center like an iron scythe. They had bypassed the galleasses entirely, sacrificing tactical perfection for speed, and now they fell upon the Christian fleet's command section from an angle that no one had anticipated. The first galley to arrive rammed the Real amidships with such force that the entire Spanish flagship shuddered, throwing men from both sides into the sea. More Ottoman ships followed, their bronze rams punching through Spanish hulls, their Marines pouring across to join their beleaguered comrades on the Sultana. The tide of battle reversed in heartbeats. The Spanish Marines, suddenly finding themselves outnumbered and surrounded, began to fall back toward their own ship. Don Juan himself was fighting a desperate rearguard action, his face a mask of fury and disbelief as his perfect victory transformed into desperate defense. But the Spanish commander was not ready to concede defeat. Even as his men retreated, he was shouting orders, reorganizing his forces, preparing to sell every Spanish life as dearly as possible. Until the Real exploded. No one ever determined exactly what caused it, whether an Ottoman fire arrow found the Spanish ship's powder magazine, or whether Greek fire from the galleasses had set off a chain reaction, or whether it was simple bad fortune that a spark landed in the wrong place at the wrong moment. The result was instantaneous and catastrophic. The Real's stern simply disappeared in a ball of orange fire that rose hundreds of feet into the air, followed by a concussion that knocked men off their feet on ships 50 yards away.
Mehmet felt the heat of it wash over him like the breath of a furnace, felt the deck of the Sultana roll beneath his feet as the shock wave passed through the water itself. When his vision cleared from the flash, half the Spanish flagship was gone. The rest was burning with fires no human agency could extinguish. And Don Juan, the great Christian commander, the bastard prince whose naval genius had brought together the most formidable anti-Ottoman alliance in history, was nowhere to be seen. The Spanish fleet, seeing their commander's ship destroyed, began a general retreat. Not an orderly withdrawal, but a panicked flight, each captain making his own decision to save his ship and crew while he still could. The Venetians and Genoese followed suit, their alliance crumbling, not from defeat in battle, but from the simple human instinct to survive. Within minutes, the entire Christian formation had dissolved, their galleys scattering toward the western horizon like leaves before a storm. The Battle of Lepanto was over, and Sultan Selim II, standing on the ruined deck of his listing flagship, covered in smoke and blood and ashes of burning ships, wept.
Telling and preparing this story took us a lot of time. So if you're enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story.
The sun was setting over the Gulf of Patras, painting the smoke-choked sky in shades of orange and purple that would have been beautiful if not for what they illuminated. The water was choked with debris, broken ships, shattered oars, thousands upon thousands of bodies floating in their armor or clinging to wreckage in the vain hope of rescue that would come too late for most. Mehmet moved through this maritime graveyard in a commandeered rowboat, his medical satchel once again at his side, though most of its contents had been exhausted hours ago. Around him, other rescue boats picked through the wreckage, pulling survivors from the water without asking which flag they had fought beneath. Drowning was drowning after all, and even enemies could recognize the simple humanity of not letting men die when they could be saved. The young physician was numb now, not from the cold water that sloshed in the bottom of his boat, but from the sheer scale of death he had witnessed. He had stopped counting bodies after the first 100. He had stopped feeling horror after pulling his 5th drowned child from the water. Cabin boys, most of them, too young to have beards, sent to war because their families needed the money or because some recruiter had painted glorious pictures of naval service that had no connection to reality. A hand emerged from the water ahead, grasping weakly at a piece of floating timber. Mehmet directed his rowers toward it and found a Spanish soldier, barely conscious, his face pale from blood loss, a terrible wound in his side that should have killed him hours ago, but somehow hadn't. "Ayuda?" the Spaniard whispered. "Help?" Mehmet didn't speak Spanish, but he understood the word. It was the same in every language, the final plea of the dying, the question that asks not whether help was possible, but whether anyone still cared enough to try. "I've got you," Mehmet said in Turkish, knowing the man wouldn't understand the words, but hoping he'd understand the intention. "You're safe now." They pulled the Spaniard into the boat, carefully, because his wound opened further with the movement, and because rough handling might kill a man this close to death. Mehmet immediately set to work, packing the wound with the last of his clean cloth, administering a tincture of poppy for the pain, doing the 100 small things that separated professional medicine from well-meaning but useless ministration. The Spaniard's eyes found his, and in them Mehmet saw not hatred or fear, but simple gratitude. The soldier's lips moved, forming words in Spanish that the physician couldn't parse, but the message was clear enough. "Thank you. Thank you for not letting me die alone in the water." "Row for the Sultana," Mehmet commanded his crew. "This man needs a proper surgeon, and I'm out of supplies." As they pulled toward the Ottoman flagship, now safely anchored in calmer waters, her fires extinguished, though she would never sail again, Mehmet let his eyes sweep across the devastation of the Gulf. Even in victory, the cost was staggering. More than 30 Ottoman galleys had been sunk or burned beyond salvage. Thousands of Ottoman soldiers and sailors would never return to their families.
The flower of Ottoman naval power had been cut down in a single afternoon of carnage that had achieved what exactly? The Christians had retreated, yes. Don Juan was dead, confirmed now by survivors who had seen him die in the explosion. The Holy League fleet had been shattered, its ships scattered from here to Italy, many of them so damaged they would be months in repair. But the Ottomans had won nothing except the right to claim they hadn't lost. They had saved no territory, conquered no new lands, achieved no strategic objective except denying the Christians their victory. It was a triumph measured not in gains, but in the absence of catastrophic defeat. And the cost? Allah, the cost! They reached the Sultana as full darkness fell, the gulf now lit with lanterns and the dying embers of burned ships. Mehmet helped transfer the Spanish soldier to the ship's hospital area, a euphemistic name for a section of deck where the wounded lay in rows, attended by physicians who had been working without pause for 12 hours and showed no signs of being allowed to stop. The head surgeon, a grizzled veteran named Ismail, who had set more bones and cut off more limbs than Mehmet could imagine, looked up from a patient whose leg he was amputating by lantern light. "Another one? Spanish, I see. Well, bring him here. We don't ask questions about flags when a man's bleeding." Mehmet helped transfer his patient, then stood swaying with exhaustion, not sure if he should help Ismail or find somewhere to collapse. The decision was made for him when a palace guard appeared at his elbow. "Mehmet ibn Ibrahim, the Sultan requires your presence on the command deck." The young physician blinked, trying to process this through the fog of exhaustion. "Now? But the wounded?" "Now," the guard confirmed, and his tone suggested refusing a sultan's summons was not an option, regardless of how many men were bleeding nearby. Mehmet followed the guard up to the command deck, acutely aware of his appearance. His robes were stiff with dried blood, his hands still stained despite repeated washing, his face smudged with smoke and ash. He looked less like a butcher who had worked a particularly busy day. Sultan Selim stood at the ship's bow, staring out over the darkened gulf. The ruler had changed into clean clothes, but he looked older somehow, as if the battle had aged him years and hours. Ali Pasha stood nearby, his arm in a sling from a wound taken during the boarding action, his expression unreadable in the lantern light. "Your Majesty," Mehmet said, bowing as deeply as his exhausted body allowed. Selim turned, and in Mehmet's eyes, Mehmet saw not triumph or relief or even the simple satisfaction of survival. It was closer to grief. "Walk with me, Mehmet ibn Ibrahim," the Sultan said. "Ali, ensure we are not disturbed." The admiral nodded and withdrew, leaving Mehmet alone with the most powerful man in the Ottoman Empire. They walked in silence along the ship's rail, their steps the only sound save for the gentle slap of water against the hull. Finally, Selim spoke. "My father conquered Belgrade, Rhodes, and Hungary. He laid siege to Vienna himself. He signed treaties with France and made the kings of Europe tremble at the mention of his name." The Sultan's voice was quiet, almost conversational. "And I fought one battle, lost 40 ships, sacrificed thousands of men, and accomplished nothing except avoiding defeat. Tell me, physician, is this the legacy that future generations will remember?" Mehmet stood silent for a long moment, knowing that whatever he said next could define his entire future, or end it if he chose his words poorly. But exhaustion had burned away his capacity for political calculation, leaving only truth. "Your Majesty," he said slowly, "I am not a historian or a strategist. I am a physician who spent today pulling men from the water and trying to convince their bodies not to die. I saw Ottoman sailors save Spanish soldiers and Spanish Marines weep over the bodies of Ottoman boys. I saw men who should have been enemies sharing their last bit of water before drowning together." "And what does that tell you?" asked Selim. It tells me that this battle, any battle, is a failure of imagination. That if we were clever enough, brave enough, wise enough, we would find ways to resolve our differences without feeding thousands of young men to the sea. Mehmet paused, then added, "But I also learned today that sometimes courage is not about winning. Sometimes courage is about knowing when to stop fighting." Selim turned to face him fully now, and in the Sultan's eyes, Mehmet saw a desperate need for validation, for someone to tell him that his choices had not been in vain.
"The Christians will rebuild their fleet," Selim said. "Perhaps in a year, perhaps 2. They will come again, and we will fight again, and more men will die in battles that accomplish nothing but postponing the inevitable next battle." He gripped the rail tightly. "My father would have pursued them, would have chased them to Italy, to Spain, would have conquered every Christian port in the Mediterranean rather than let them escape." "Your father was a great conqueror," Mehmed replied carefully. "But, Your Majesty, perhaps the world needs leaders who know when to stop conquering." A long silence followed these words. Then, unexpectedly, Selim laughed, a short, bitter sound that held no humor. "Do you know what I'm going to do tomorrow, Mehmed ibn Ibrahim? I'm going to send envoys to Venice and Spain. I'm going to propose a treaty, a real treaty, not the temporary truces that my father signed and broke at his convenience. I'm going to try to end this cycle of violence that has consumed the Mediterranean for centuries." "They may not accept," Mehmet ventured. "They will not accept," Selim corrected. "Not tomorrow, not next year. Perhaps not in my lifetime. The hatreds are too deep, the grievances too old, the vested interests too powerful. But I will try anyway, because the alternative is to continue this madness until one side or the other is completely destroyed." The Sultan turned back to the water, where the lights of rescue boats still moved among the wreckage, still pulling survivors from a sea that had tried to claim them all. "They will say I won the Battle of Lepanto," Selim continued softly. "The poets will write songs about our great victory, about how Sultan Selim defeated the Christian alliance and secured Ottoman dominance of the Mediterranean. But you and I know the truth, don't we, physician? We know that today everyone lost." Mehmed had no answer to that, because there was no answer. They stood together in silence, Sultan and physician, watching the lanterns move across the dark water, each light representing another attempt to save a life from the waste of this day. After a while, Selim spoke again, his voice barely above a whisper. "My youngest son asked me before I left for this campaign why the Christians hated us so much. I couldn't answer him then. I cannot answer him now. All I know is that today I saved my people from the sea of fire, saved them not by conquering it, but by surviving it, by refusing to let it consume us completely." He paused. "Perhaps that is enough. Perhaps that is all any sultan can hope to accomplish." Behind them, a cry went up from the hospital area, either triumph at a life saved or despair at one lost. Mehmed couldn't tell. But it reminded him that his work was not finished, that regardless of sultans and strategies and the grand sweep of history, there were still men whose wounds needed tending. "Your Majesty," Mehmed said carefully, "may I return to my patients?" Selim nodded. "Go. And Mehmed, when we return to Constantinople, you will indeed be made a master physician, as I promised. But more than that, I want you to establish a new medical academy, one that trains physicians not just in Ottoman territories, but from across the Mediterranean. Christian, Muslim, Jew, it matters not. Let us show that in healing, at least, we can work together." "That is an ambitious dream, Your Majesty." "All the best dreams are," Selim replied. "Now go, save as many as you can. That's all any of us can do." Mehmed bowed and withdrew, leaving the Sultan alone with his thoughts and the dark water and the memory of a battle that history would record as a victory, but which felt in every way that mattered like a loss. The journey back to Constantinople took 3 weeks, and every day of it was a reminder of what they had lost. The fleet that had sailed forth with 300 ships returned with barely 200 seaworthy vessels. The rest had been sunk, captured, or burned beyond salvage. Every ship that did return carried wounded men stacked like cordwood below decks, their cries audible even through the thick planking that separated the hospital areas from the ore decks. Mehmet spent those weeks in a haze of exhaustion and endless labor. There were always more wounds to tend, more amputations to perform, more dying men who needed someone to hold their hands as they slipped away. The Spanish soldier he had rescued, his name, he learned, was Carlos, and he had been a carpenter's son from Malaga before the war swallowed him, survived the journey, though he would never use his left arm again. Mehmet sat with him often during those long days at sea, the two of them communicating through gestures and the occasional Italian word that served as a bridge between their languages. "Why?" Carlos asked one evening, his good hand gesturing to encompass the ship, the wounded, the whole bloody enterprise of the battle. "Why we fight? My village, Christian, your city, Muslim, but we same, we hurt same, we die same." Mehmet had no answer that would satisfy either of them. He could only nod and share the wine he had been saving for truly terrible surgeries, because sometimes the only response to senseless questions was equally senseless companionship. On the 10th day of the return voyage, Hassan, the old janissary who had saved Mehmet's life during the boarding action, died of an infection that had taken root in a minor wound on his calf. The physician in Mehmet knew that he should have caught it earlier, should have seen the signs of sepsis before they became irreversible, but he had been so focused on the dramatic injuries, the missing limbs and punctured lungs, that he had missed the quiet killer growing in a simple cut. He wept over Hassan's body, this man who had fought Christians for 20 years and had, in his final days, helped Mehmet save Spanish and Venetian soldiers with the same dedication he had once brought to killing them. Ali Pasha found Mehmet there, still crying, and sat beside him in silence for a long while before speaking. "He talked about you in those last hours," the admiral said. "Said you reminded him of his son, the one who died of fever when he was still a child. Said that watching you work gave him hope that maybe his boy's death had not been entirely meaningless, that somewhere, someone was learning to preserve lives rather than just take them." "I couldn't save him," Mehmet whispered. "No one could have, Mehmet ibn Ibrahim. The trick is learning to accept that while still trying to heal the ones that can." They buried Hassan at sea that evening, wrapped in clean linen with weights at his feet, committed to the depths with prayers that seemed inadequate for a man who lived so large. The Sultan himself attended the ceremony, standing beside common sailors and slaves to honor a soldier who had served the empire for 30 years without ever rising above the rank of ordinary janissary. "This man," Selim said as the body slipped beneath the waves, "represents everything I hope to preserve about our people. Courage without cruelty, strength without arrogance, service without servility. If the empire produces no more than men like Hassan, it will have justified its existence." The words were recorded by the court scribe, but Mehmet noticed that the Sultan's voice cracked slightly as he spoke them, and that after the ceremony ended, Selim retired to his cabin and was not seen again until the following morning. When Constantinople finally appeared on the horizon, its minarets and domes rising above the Marmara Sea like a city from legend, the entire fleet fell silent. Men who had been joking minutes before stood mute, staring at the home they had left 4 months ago, wondering if the city they returned to would even recognize them. The homecoming was not what they had expected. There were no crowds lining the harbor, no celebrations of victory, no poets singing praises to the conquering heroes.
Instead, there was a strange, subdued quality to the city, as if Constantinople itself had felt the weight of what had been done in its name and found the burden heavier than expected. Messengers had brought news of the battle weeks earlier, triumphant reports of Ottoman victory, carefully edited to minimize mention of the cost. But the truth had a way of seeping through official narratives, and by the time the fleet arrived, the city knew. They knew how many ships had been lost. They knew that nearly every family with men in the fleet would be receiving death notifications or welcoming home crippled veterans who would never work again. The first night back in the palace, Mehmet was summoned to the Sultan's private chambers, a breach of protocol so extreme that the guards seemed uncertain whether to allow it. But Selim had insisted, and what sultans insisted upon generally happened. He found the ruler of the Ottoman Empire sitting alone in a room lined with books and maps, staring at a particular chart of the Mediterranean that showed the extent of Ottoman holdings. A lamp burned low on the table beside him, casting shadows that made Selim look even more worn than the journey had left him. "They're calling it the greatest naval victory in Ottoman history," Selim said without preamble. "The Grand Vizier has already commissioned 3 poems celebrating my tactical genius. The Venetian ambassador has requested an audience to discuss peace terms, and the Spanish are rumored to be recalling their Mediterranean fleet to defend their own coasts." "That sounds like victory, Your Majesty," Mehmet ventured. "It sounds like lies," Selim corrected, his voice harsh with self-recrimination. "We won nothing except the right to claim we didn't lose. The Christians will rebuild, we will rebuild, and in 5 years, or 10, or 20, we will do it all again, and more young men will feed the sea. For what? So poets can write songs? So sultans can feel like they've matched their fathers' glories?" He stood abruptly, crossing to a window that looked out over the city. Constantinople sprawled before them, a metropolis of nearly 500,000 souls, each one dependent on the empire's strength for their safety and prosperity. "I received a message today from the mother of Ali Pasha's nephew, the boy you saved during the battle. She wanted to thank me personally for preserving her son's life. Do you know what she said to me, Mehmet ibn Ibrahim?" The physician shook his head. "She said, 'Your Majesty, my son tells me that you fought beside common soldiers as if you were one of them, that you bled and suffered as they did. I pray that this experience has taught you what my husband learned after 30 years of service, that every soldier is someone's son, and every battle is someone's grief, and the greatest victory is the one that need not be fought.'" Then Selim turned back from the window, and Mehmet saw tears on the Sultan's face, not the silent tears of the battlefield, but open, unashamed weeping.
She's right, isn't she? All of this, the empire, the conquests, the glory my father left me, it's built on the bodies of men like Hassan and boys like her son. And for what? What have we truly gained that justifies their suffering? "Your Majesty," Mehmet said carefully, "I cannot answer questions of empire and strategy, but I can tell you what I learned in 3 weeks tending to wounded men from both sides. I learned that suffering is the same in any language, that courage is not the absence of fear, but the choice to act despite it, and that the greatest act of leadership is not knowing how to win battles, but knowing when to stop fighting them." Selim wiped his eyes, a gesture so human and unguarded that Mehmet felt privileged to witness it. "You're young to be so wise," the Sultan said. "I'm not wise, Your Majesty. I'm just tired of watching people die." "Then you and I have something in common," Selim replied. "Come, there's something I want to show you." He led Mehmet through the palace corridors to a room Mehmet had never seen before, a private library where Selim apparently kept his personal collection of books and manuscripts. The Sultan pulled a particular volume from the shelf, its binding worn from frequent handling. "This," he said, is a copy of the histories written by Herodotus, the Greek who chronicled the wars between Persia and Greece nearly 2,000 years ago. Do you know what he said about warfare? Mehmet shook his head. He said, "In peace, sons bury their fathers. In war, fathers bury their sons." Selim set the book down gently, reverently. For 2 millennia, empires have been committing that abomination, reversing the natural order, sacrificing the young to preserve the ambitions of the old. And we've accomplished what exactly? The Persians fell, the Greeks fell, Rome fell, Byzantium fell. Even we, the Ottomans, will fall someday. All of this blood, and nothing remains but ghosts and ruins. Then why continue? Mehmet asked. If you believe all empires fall, why maintain this one? Because, Selim said slowly, the alternative is worse. If the Ottoman Empire falls tomorrow, who fills the void? The Spanish with their Inquisition, the Holy Roman Emperor with his religious wars. At least we provide stability, trade, protection for minorities. At least we offer something better than chaos. He paused, then added, but that doesn't mean we have to perpetuate the cycle of endless warfare. We can be strong without being aggressive. We can defend without conquering. We can exist without consuming everything around us. Is that why you want to establish the medical academy? To show that the empire can create as well as destroy? Partly, Selim admitted, but also because I genuinely believe that knowledge, especially medical knowledge, transcends borders and faiths. A Christian doctor and a Muslim doctor treating the same patient will use the same techniques because human bodies don't care about theology. If we can show that different peoples can work together in healing, perhaps we can eventually show them how to work together in governance, in trade, in all the things that actually matter. He pulled a large scroll. Architectural drawings, Mehmet realized, of the proposed medical academy. The building was magnificent, designed in a style that blended Ottoman, Byzantine, and Italian architectural elements. It would have libraries, surgical theaters, gardens for growing medicinal herbs, and dormitories for students from across the known world. Construction begins in 3 months, Selim said. You will be the academy's first dean. You will have complete authority to recruit faculty and students, regardless of their origin or faith. The only requirements are competence and a genuine desire to heal. Your Majesty, I'm barely 23 years old, Mehmet protested. I've only just completed my apprenticeship. Surely there are more experienced physicians. Experience is not what I need, Selim interrupted. I need vision. I need someone who understands that medicine is not about Ottoman techniques or Christian techniques, but about human techniques. Someone who pulled Spanish soldiers from the water because it was the right thing to do, not because it was politically expedient. Someone who wept over a dead janissary, not because he was Ottoman, but because he was a man. Mehmet stood silent, overwhelmed by the responsibility being thrust upon him. Finally, he managed, I don't know if I can do this. I don't know either, Selim admitted with a slight smile. But that's the secret of leadership, Mehmet ibn Ibrahim. None of us truly knows if we can accomplish what we set out to do. We simply decide that the attempt is worth making, and then we make it.
3 months later, Mehmet stood in a half-constructed building on the outskirts of Constantinople, watching workmen raise the walls of what would become the Mediterranean Medical Academy. True to his word, Sultan Selim had provided the funding and the royal decree that would allow physicians from any nation to study here, sharing knowledge that had been hoarded like treasure for too many centuries. It was a small thing, perhaps, in the face of empires and armies and the great movements of history, but it was something. Old Hassan's death had affected more people than Mehmet had anticipated. The Janissary story of a warrior who had spent his final days helping to save enemy soldiers had spread through Constantinople like wildfire, inspiring a generation of young men to reconsider what it meant to serve the empire. Several had already approached Mehmet, asking if they could study medicine, wanting to honor Hassan's memory by learning to preserve lives rather than take them. Among them was Ali Pasha's nephew, now fully recovered from his wound. The boy, his name was Yusuf, had abandoned his plans for a military career and thrown himself into medical studies with the fervor of the truly converted. He would be one of the academy's first students, Christian and Muslim physicians learning side by side. The first international faculty members were already arriving. There was Dr. Andreas from Venice, who had developed new techniques for treating battlefield wounds and was eager to share them. Rabbi Solomon from Toledo, an expert in herbal medicines who had been driven from Spain by the Inquisition and found refuge in Ottoman lands. Father Constantine, a Greek Orthodox monk who ran a hospital in Crete and believed that healing was the truest expression of Christian charity. They gathered in the half-finished building, these men who weeks ago might have been enemies, separated by faith and language and the accidents of geography, and began to talk. Not about theology or politics or the things that divided them, but about medicine, about which techniques worked best for setting fractures, about how to prevent infections in surgical wounds, about the properties of different herbs and whether they could be combined safely. Mehmet listened to them debate with a sense of wonder. This was what the world could be if they chose differently. Not perfect, there were still tensions, still moments when old prejudices surfaced, but better, measurably, tangibly better. Sultan Selim visited the academy regularly during its construction, often arriving unannounced and without ceremony, simply wanting to see the progress. On one such visit, he found Mehmet teaching an impromptu anatomy lesson to a mixed group of students, Ottoman, Venetian, Spanish, and one young woman from Egypt who had disguised herself as a boy to gain entry. The Sultan watched for nearly an hour before making his presence known. When he did, expecting the students to scatter in terror at the sight of the Ottoman ruler, he was surprised when they simply bowed and returned to their studies. One, a brash Spanish youth whose father had died at Lepanto, even asked Selim a question about the human heart, having heard that the Sultan had studied natural philosophy in his youth. Later, walking through the construction site with Mehmet, Selim laughed, genuinely laughed, for perhaps the first time since the battle. "Do you know what just happened?" he asked. "A Spanish boy whose father I likely killed asked me a question about anatomy as if I were simply a knowledgeable person rather than an enemy sultan. That, Mehmet ibn Ibrahim, is worth more than 1,000 military victories." "The academy was your idea, Your Majesty," Mehmet reminded him. "The academy was a hope," Selim corrected. "You made it a reality. There's a significant difference." As for the treaty negotiations Selim had initiated with Venice and Spain, they proceeded slowly, hampered by centuries of distrust and the opposition of hawks on both sides who saw any peace as weakness. But they proceeded. The Venetian ambassador, who had initially scoffed at the idea of lasting peace, found himself increasingly sympathetic after his own physician, who had studied briefly under Mehmet, saved his daughter's life using techniques learned from the academy. Small things, individual connections, one life saved at a time. It was not the epic transformation that poets sang about. It was not the grand conquest that built empires, but it was real. And it was spreading, and it was changing minds in ways that armies never could. Carlos, the Spanish carpenter's son whom Mehmet had pulled from the water, eventually returned to Malaga on a prisoner exchange. But before he left, he spent 2 months at the academy, learning basic medicine and wound care. He wrote to Mehmet 3 years later, describing how he had established a small hospital in his village, how he had trained other veterans to provide basic medical care, how the skills he had learned from an Ottoman physician were now saving Spanish lives.
Perhaps, Carlos wrote in his careful Italian, perhaps this is how truly peace begins, not with treaties and ambassadors, but with men who have seen war deciding there must be a better way. Mehmet kept that letter in his desk, reading it whenever he doubted whether any of this mattered, whether one academy in one city could truly make a difference in a world so committed to violence. 5 years after Lepanto, the Mediterranean Medical Academy held its first graduation ceremony. 23 students from 7 different nations received their diplomas, certified as physicians trained in the most advanced techniques available anywhere in the world. They would scatter across the Mediterranean, carrying with them not just medical knowledge, but the revolutionary idea that people of different faiths could work together for common good. Sultan Selim attended the ceremony, now visibly older, his hair gone gray at the temples. The treaty with Venice had finally been signed the previous year, a genuine peace treaty, not merely a temporary truce. Spain remained hostile, but even there, voices calling for accommodation rather than endless warfare were growing louder. As Selim watched the graduates receive their diplomas, Mehmet saw tears on Selim's face again. But these tears were different than those shed in the palace after the battle. These were tears of hope rather than grief, of possibility rather than regret. "They will say I achieved less than my father," Selim murmured to Mehmet. "They will say I fought one major battle and spent the rest of my reign in fruitless peace negotiations. The poets will not sing of Sultan Selim the Magnificent." "No, Your Majesty," Mehmet agreed. "But perhaps they will sing of Sultan Selim the Wise, the man who saved his people not by defeating them on the sea of fire, but by choosing not to return to it, the man who understood that the greatest victory is the one that prevents the next war." Selim smiled slightly. "You become eloquent in your old age, Mehmet ibn Ibrahim." "I'm 28, Your Majesty." "Old age for a physician who should have died at Lepanto," Selim countered. "We're both living on borrowed time, you and I. The question is what we do with it." They stood together as the ceremony concluded, watching young physicians from across the Mediterranean embrace each other as colleagues rather than enemies, and in that moment Mehmet understood something fundamental about history and empires and the human capacity for change. The Battle of Lepanto would be remembered. It would be taught in military academies, analyzed by strategists, painted by artists who emphasized the drama and minimized the horror. Historians would debate who truly won, whether it marked the decline of Ottoman naval power or merely a temporary setback. But perhaps in some future century, when empires rose and fell as they always did, there would be another kind of remembering, a recognition that on that blood-soaked day in October 1571, 2 men, a sultan who had never wanted to be a warrior and a physician who had never wanted to be a soldier, had looked into the abyss of endless warfare and decided there must be another way. They had not ended war. They could not erase the hatreds and grievances that had accumulated over centuries, but they had planted seeds in the form of an academy where former enemies learned to heal together, in the form of treaties that were genuine attempts at coexistence rather than mere pauses between conflicts, in the form of individual acts of mercy and compassion that rippled outwards in ways impossible to measure. The sea of fire had not consumed them. They had passed through it and emerged on the other side, scarred, diminished, but carrying with them the knowledge that survival was not enough. They had to create something that made the survival worth the cost. And so they had. As the sun set over Constantinople, painting the city in shades of gold and amber, Mehmet ibn Ibrahim stood in the courtyard of the Mediterranean Medical Academy, surrounded by students from a dozen nations, and allowed himself to hope. Hope that the seeds they had planted would take root. Hope that the lessons learned in blood and fire would not be forgotten. Hope that someday, perhaps, humans would learn to solve their differences without feeding their children to the sea.
It was a fragile hope, easily broken, constantly threatened by the gravity of history and the inertia of ancient hatreds. But it was hope nonetheless. And sometimes, in a world that had just survived a sea of fire, hope was the greatest victory of all.
The Battle of Lepanto, October 7, 1571, marked a turning point in Mediterranean history. While this narrative took creative liberties, particularly with the fate of Don Juan of Austria, who actually survived and lived until 1578, it captured essential truths about the battle's cost and consequences. Sultan Selim II did indeed pursue diplomatic solutions after Lepanto, though with limited success during his lifetime. The seeds of accommodation he planted would eventually grow, though it would take centuries. The battle demonstrated that even empires have limits, and that sometimes the wisest victory is knowing when to stop fighting. The Mediterranean Medical Academy described in the story is fictional, but it represents the kind of cross-cultural cooperation that did eventually develop, slowly and imperfectly, in the centuries following Lepanto. Real institutions for shared learning between Islamic and Christian scholars did exist and would continue to develop, proving that even in times of great conflict, the human capacity for cooperation and compassion could persist. In the end, the Battle of Lepanto saved no one, but perhaps the choices made in its aftermath saved multitudes yet unborn. The end.
Up next, 2 more incredible stories are waiting for you right on your screen. If you enjoyed this one, you won't want to miss these. Just click to watch and don't forget to subscribe.